Cheers. Today I'd like to speak a little bit about what I've termed the canary in a coal mine in the Near East. The the title of the lecture is 70,000 Assyrians, but you won't know it's about the Assyrians until much later in the talk. So you need to stick around, and it's a bit long-winded, so please bear with it. And I'll begin with some, a bit of a historical background to what might have led to the title of this talk. Now, during the weeks between September 29th and October 12th, 2008, 15 young Christians were murdered in cold blood in the streets of Mosul, Iraq. A manhunt followed. None of the offenders were ever identified or brought to justice, and with impunity, killings would continue into the present day. In Iraq, in Egypt, and elsewhere, wherever Near Eastern Christians came into view. For centuries, the cross had been trampled in the dust of Abraham, as put in a prophetic way by French historian of the Assyrians, Sébastien de Courtois. In quiet desperation, Christians succumbed. Old Christian quarters disappeared. Neighborhoods took stock of their dead. Clergymen gave last rites. And unease gripped the precious few left behind in what Courtois calls empty, dilapidated spiritual Disneylands. The destruction of Eastern Christendom is an order of things that raises no eyebrows. It is hardly a novelty. The deliberate, methodical dispossession and outright erasure of histories and languages and cultures and memories of indigenous non-Muslim Middle Easterners is a saga 14 centuries in the making. Yet normative Middle East scholarship and legacy Middle East punditry often praise themselves for always identifying and indicting the same usual suspects, and namely those are economic hardships, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and essentially skirting the real reasons for the looming disappearance of Near Eastern Christians, and for all intents and purposes, the end of Near Eastern Christendom. Still in a millennial attempt at clinging to their tenuous existence, and often in hostile environments in their historical homelands, no less, Near Eastern Christians have always aimed at persevering, at casting themselves as cultural intermediaries, as hyphens, as bridges, as it were, between East and West, transmitting to the Western world the faintest pulsations of the Eastern and Arab world, intercepting before anyone else the life ripples of the Mediterranean, of Europe, and of the universe, and retransmitting them to the nations of the hinterland, to those desiccated realms of sands and sleepy mosques. Such is an element of an eternal truth, wrote Lebanon's Druze chieftain Kamal Jumblat in 1945. What I've just reproduced here is an exact quote from Kamal Jumblat. He continues saying that it is indeed Near Eastern Christians who make the Near Eastern mosaic a mosaic. Without them, there is only Middle Eastern blandness and slumbers in old shrines. And this is again, Jumblat himself, who is not exactly a friend of Near Eastern Christians, but still in his telling, in the 1940s at least, in the heyday of Lebanon's experimentation with its dialogue of cultures vocation, the staid, austere, traditional, and rigidly ordered Middle East slumped in stark contrast to the dynamism, the edginess, the fluidity, and the intellectual audacity practiced by Levantine Christians. This unique breed of polyglot, cosmopolitan cultural intermediaries. Indeed, the radiance of ancient Greece and Rome, the splendor of Constantinople and Alexandria, and the church fathers themselves, from Ephraim the Syrian to Cyprian of Carthage, to Clement and Augustine and Ignatius, and this is not to mention the Jewish founders of Christianity themselves, right? All of these people are Near Eastern, not Western, not European bequests to Christendom. And just as Europe, as we know it today, may be unthinkable without, say, a Paris, so would the diversity, the flexibility, the capaciousness and moral elegance of the Eastern Mediterranean be unthinkable without that region's enterprising minority peoples, Christians and Jews and others, to be sure, but Christians more specifically, because in our times it is the Christians in particular who are the people on the verge of extinction. Under early Islam, spanning the 7th to the 10th centuries, Christian monasteries radiated a unique indigenous kind of polyglossia, maintaining a fervid movement of translation and diffusion in scientific and philosophical traditions of classical antiquity. Indeed, long into the second millennium of the Christian era, the big picture, linguistically and culturally speaking, had been one of a congenital Christian bilingualism and multilingualism, a feature that is still a Near Eastern fixture and mode of being in our times today. And so, in addition to countless varieties of Arabic brought along with the 7th century Muslim colonizers, pockets of Aramaic, Hebrew, Coptic, Armenian, and Greek speech communities survive to this day in parts of the countries of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and Turkey. And this is not to mention Israel itself, which brings its own varieties of linguistic communities to the region. And so it is precisely this distinctly Near Eastern Christian phenomenon that made the intellectual radiance of 9th century Abbasid Baghdad possible. And we speak of Abbasid Baghdad as having saved Western civilization, if you will. But Abbasid Baghdad is a world of Islam that had become heir to Greco-Roman traditions precisely through the conduit of non-Muslims and non-Arabs, and in the main Near Eastern Christians, who made that transmission, that translation process possible. And so when one speaks of an Arab-Islamic period of intellectual effervescence and transmission during the golden age of Islam, one is speaking of an enterprise that would have been impossible without Syriac Christians, without Jews, Persians, Indians, but again, learned polyglot Near Eastern Christians who replicated the same enterprise in modern times from the 19th century to the present day. Byzantium never forgot, famously wrote French historian Sylvain Guggenheim, noting that Near Eastern Christians were instrumental in the preservation and diffusion from east to west of the scientific and philosophical corpus of classical antiquity, a scientific and philosophical corpus that is their own, that is, that proceeded from those minority peoples. Even today, our modern world's most noble, universal, and humanistic of human endeavors may likewise be attributed to the impulses and sensitivity of Near Eastern minority peoples. Let me give you an example. This is an exact quote. Quote, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." This This is the introduction, this is the first sentence of the preamble to the 1948 United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Humans, would that preamble continue, quote, are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Likewise, this in continuation, Article 18 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Article 18 stressed that, quote, everybody has a right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change one's religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest one's religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. It is it's not far-fetched imagining the authors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, who are incidentally two people from the Near East, Lebanon's Charles Malik and Israel's Abba Eban. It's not difficult, I would say, imagining them having had Near Eastern minorities in mind when they produced that famous document's Central Themes over 70 years ago. And this is confirmed in a text of Charles Malik himself, written almost 35 years later in 1980, with specifically Lebanon in mind this time around, affirming that, and I quote, the future does not belong to oppression but to liberation in the Middle East. The future will not bring about a contraction of existing freedom in the Middle East, but a widening of its scope. The future will not conduce to the enlargement and grounding of slavery, but to diminishing its sway and getting rid of it altogether. The future does not belong to discriminating against the religious minorities, but to these minorities themselves winning complete equality in their responsibilities, rights, and obligations. The future does not belong to the realm of darkness, but to the realm of light, which shone and continues to shine in Lebanon. End quote. It is eerie to read these confident words of Malik's today, some 45 years later, not from Malik's perch, not from Malik's sort of optimistic purview, but from today gazing at a Lebanon that is an obscene deformation of what Malik foresaw or saw in it. Yet Charles Malik's and Abba Eban's were principles upheld and flaunted vociferously by Eastern Christians and Jews since at least the coming of Islam in the 7th century, and for our purposes, for this course, since the dawn of the age of liberalism in the late 18th century Middle East. But this role assigned to Near Eastern minorities, that of cultural intermediaries, if you will, and healers and mediators, buying time in an increasingly shrinking space for pluralism, this role seems to have outlived its utility. Indeed, Near Eastern Christians, an indigenous lot by any measure, seem to have become one people too many in a Middle East that is today taken to be unitary, uniform, homogeneous, exclusively Muslim or Arab, or predominantly Muslim and Arab. The numbers, despite the lack of reliable censuses, do bear out the reality of a looming historical calamity. There is a sense of an impending fin de race among Near Eastern Christians, noted Lebanese historian Kamal Salibi. Fin de race, the end of a people, the end of a civilization. Race here, race, is used in the French sense to mean civilization, not complexion, not skin color. A doyen of Lebanese historians and himself a Christian, the body of Kamal Salibi, from whom this quote comes, the body of his work had not been particularly sensitive to the plight of Near Eastern Christians. Yet by the turn of the 21st century, he had already begun admitting the obvious, that the collapse of Near Eastern Christian history was very near at hand. That after 14 centuries of having been Islam's exemplars of affability and originality and innovation and reconciliation, in a space where pluralism is in decline, where religious extremism oppresses and kills, and where the world assents and appeases and submits or looks away, Near Eastern Christians are essentially disappearing. They tend to be, in Salibi's words, they tend to be intelligent, well qualified, highly educated. So now they're opting to simply take their skill sets and move elsewhere, go to more hospitable climes. It's a very serious matter, stressed Salibi, because each time a Near Eastern Christian leaves, no other Christian comes to fill his place, and that's detrimental to the Middle Eastern mosaic. Again, it is the Christians who keep the Middle East a Middle Eastern mosaic rather than a monolithic Muslim world. And this is the conclusion of Kamal Salibi. But unfortunately, the die has been cast. In 1920, there were close to 3 million Christians in what is today Turkey. That number has dwindled to barely 300,000 in our times, and that is to say a drop from a robust 25% of the population 100 years ago to a mere 4% today. This is a dramatic drop, by the way. And in the main, the people who remain are people who are unable to leave. So they are, a 4% is teetering on the brink of extinction. Likewise, across the Mediterranean in 1952, when Jamal Abdel Nasser came to power in Egypt, there were almost 500,000 Egyptian Christians, other than Copts, in what is today the Arab Republic of Egypt. Today, following Nasser's liquidation of Egypt's age of cosmopolitanism, non-Coptic Christians are non-extant in the land that once called St. Mark the Evangelist, its patron saint, the founder of the National Church of Egypt. So St. Mark to Egypt is like St. Patrick to Ireland. So even the Copts themselves in Egypt are a pitiful specter of a once dominant, confident native Egyptian community, a group that had never been an avid practitioner of immigration. The Copts now are leaving Egypt at an alarming rate, and although there are no censuses in terms of numbers, the exodus is revealed in the diaspora. So from 3 Coptic parishes in North America during the early 1950s, in Mexico and Canada and the United States, the number has swelled to over 200 Coptic parishes in the United States alone. And who is unfamiliar with the anguish and disorientation and lostness of Lebanon's Maronite community, a community that for all intents and purposes had invented modern Lebanon, spawning its new republic as a confederation of minorities, to be sure, but first and foremost perhaps as a safe haven for persecuted Christians. The Maronites, who, in the words of one historian, who traveled through time with dignity, who through 14 centuries of existence in an Islamized Levant never lived as dhimmis, and indeed for some time even exacted tribute from the walis, from the governors, the Muslim governors of Damascus. They are now relegated to abject dhimmitude. They're divested of their historical, cultural, and political relevance, and they are demoted to a position of servility, a kind of servitude whereby Christians live by sufferance, live but are essentially barely alive. Now, with the preceding in mind, it may be imperative, perhaps even vital, that the plight of Near Eastern Christians be looked upon as a distinct and separate plight from all the other problems plaguing the Near and Middle East. It is imperative that their troubled present days be viewed not as a reaction to, nor as an emanation of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but as a plight with its own distinct history. Indeed, the plight of Near Eastern Christians is the sequel, perhaps even the culmination of a long process of squeezing out that had begun with the 7th century Muslim conquest of the Near and Middle East, but that for a while had stopped at the foot of the Lebanon mountains. But that pause, which might have lasted some 14 centuries, seems to be possessed today of a new kind of dynamism in this 21st century. Lebanon is now also being swept away in the tide of ascending religiosity and a rising religious zeal. And so from people who wagered their survival on compromise and different iterations of entente cordiale, a conversation of civilizations, if you will, or a dialogue of civilizations, Near Eastern Christians, after having been the region's cultural intermediaries and conduits, are now our time's proverbial coal mine canaries. A warning sign, as it were, and an ominous indicator that the Near and Middle East are no longer hospitable to their pre-Arab First Nations. And that's what they are, really. I mean, Near Eastern Christians and Jews are the First Nations of the Near and Middle East. And yet, in the West, the destruction of Eastern Christianity barely causes a stir. Mainstream media and Middle East scholarship hardly mention what in the Middle East is now business as usual. There's clearly a prevailing hierarchy in the media and in the academy's treatment of Middle East violence. Some Middle Eastern victims are worthy of academic conferences and research grants and BDS campaigns and social justice clamoring championed by indignant professors, and some Near Eastern peoples do get airtime on prime time all the time. Others simply don't receive the dignity of being even mentioned. Near Eastern Christians are not a top priority, to be honest. They're uncouth, cross-wearing primitives. At least that's how they're viewed in a post-religious West. So they're not cause for anyone's righteous indignation. They're unfit for our moral gauge and outrage. They're too Christian in a world beholden to political correctness and cultural relativism and portrayals of the Middle East as a homogeneous Arab-Muslim preserve where only Arabs and Muslims can be righteous victims and where only non-Muslims are the perennial offender. This is arguably the saddest chapter in the Near Eastern Christians' 14 centuries long saga of dispossession. Essentially the distortion and dismissal of their plight as a modern phenomenon and the reduction of its causes to demonstrably unrelated factors. This much, at least, is validated. For instance, recently in a commentary published in the Los Angeles Times on the heels of the 2011 New Year's Eve bombing in churches in Egypt, the LA Times says authorities worry that Christian communities in relatively safe countries such as Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Iran are also shrinking, though driven more by a surge for economic opportunities than by fear of violence. Middle Eastern Christians tend to be better educated and more Western-oriented than their Muslim compatriots, which is false, by the way. It's a racist statement, since we can racialize pretty much everything today. I would say that is a racist statement, but they tend to be better educated and more Western-oriented than their Muslim compatriots, and often utilize family and religious ties abroad to emigrate. This is the LA Times. Now, incidentally, this patronizing analysis is in good company. The apolitical, tax-exempt, eco-friendly National Geographic magazine, for instance, deemed it fitting to attribute the disappearance of Near Eastern Christians to, one, the establishment of the State of Israel and the 11th century Crusades. Never mind that the dispossession of these first nations of the Middle East is antecedent to both Israel and the Crusades. Yet, Arabs and Muslims of good conscience are taking heed of this crucial moment, the disappearance of peoples who are foundational to the region. And they have begun indeed summoning their own, calling their own people, Muslims and Arabs, calling them to task, pressing for introspection and scrutiny and accountability. Shortly after the fall of Mosul into the hands of the Islamic State in 2014, in a searing cri de coeur in the Kuwaiti daily Al-Qabas, Ahmad al-Sarraf, a public intellectual and journalist, issued his own decent man's indictment of the crimes being committed in the name of his faith against the battered Christians of the Near East. In a combustive, courageous, tongue-in-cheek editorial titled "Be Gone, Christians," Sarraf facetiously and in a diatribe lampooning the ISIS playbook, he noted that, quote, Muslims could not care less that the Near Eastern Christians may be the indigenous peoples of Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and so forth. He demanded that they still be expelled anyway, so that Muslims would no longer be put to shame when their eyes meet the searching gaze of Christians wondering what had gone wrong with Islam. Yes, be gone already, continued Sarraf. And this is a quote, okay, and take with you your mercy, for with al-Nusra and ISIS and al-Qaeda and the rest of them on our sides, the gangs of Muslim brothers and their latest, finest products, we are scarcely in need of the Christians' mercy and compassion and diversity. Let the bloodletting commence. Let the violence reign supreme. Let the hearts get ripped out of their chest cavities. Let the human livers get eaten raw. Let the tongues be torn out. Let the necks get hacked off. And let the knees get shattered. For we shall eagerly return to the medicine of old, to our herbal remedies and our old musty books of alchemy and witchcraft. Yes, be gone, Christians, and leave us be to our desert creed. For we crave the glint of our swords. We crave the glint of our swords, the heat of our sands, and the energy of our mules. We scarcely need you, your civilization, and your scientific and literary contributions, for we have our own capital in abundance, in our gangs of murderers and bloodthirsty butchers and executioners. Scram, Christians, and spare us your civilization. We are replacing your culture with that of the grave diggers. That op-ed is relatively recent, but its contents are symptomatic of a long-standing epidemic that has, for 14 centuries, pitted the youngest of the children of Abraham against their elders. if we could use a Western example to illustrate how serious the extinction of Christendom in the East, how serious the repercussions might be. The example of France may be instructive. When in the late 17th century, in 1685, Louis XIV, Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King, to quote the Beatles, when he revoked his grandfather Henry IV's Edict of Nantes, which was at the end of the 16th century, the Edict of Nantes granted Francis Calvinists national rights and freedom of worship. The Calvinists of France were known as the Huguenots. When Louis XIV revoked that edict, those Huguenots began being persecuted and massacred, and eventually they were expelled from their homeland, from France. They went on to pollinate and enrich and contribute to the prosperity of other places, namely London and Berlin and Amsterdam specifically. And by that they denuded France itself of an important facet of its cultural heritage, depriving France of one of its most enterprising communities that were very similar to the Christians of the Near East. From our purview here in the United States, you're all familiar, I assume, with the initials FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where Delano, the middle name, is an Huguenot French name. It comes from an ancestor of Roosevelt. Delanoë is the French last name, and Delanoë. FDR could have been in France, but today he's part of the cultural accretions of America. But Delanoë were French Huguenots expelled, went to Amsterdam, and eventually ended up. Their descendants ended up on the Mayflower, ended up here in America. There are other examples like this. The Muslims and Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, when they were expelled after the Reconquista in 1492, did likewise, emigrated to the Eastern Mediterranean, to then the Ottoman Empire, and enriched the Ottoman Empire. Likewise with the expelled Christians of Egypt. I mentioned earlier the liquidation of the age of cosmopolitanism in Egypt with the rise of Arab nationalism. Well, those Christians went on to become foundational elements of modern French pop culture. Those of you who are familiar with mid to late 20th century French pop culture, music, etc., names like Georges Moustaki, Demis Roussos, Dalida, Claude François, those names may be familiar. Those were Egyptian Christians who got expelled and ended up in France. Claude François, for instance, was a performer, singer, songwriter. He wrote in the mid to late 60s a famous French song called Comme d'habitude, as usual. That song, the English rights to the song were sold to the folks of Frank Sinatra, and Frank Sinatra made it into his signature song, My Way. It became My Way. Initially, Comme d'habitude, as usual, becomes in English My Way, and the English lyrics were to continue the circle. The English lyrics were written by the son of Lebanese emigres to Canada, also a singer-songwriter by the name of Paul Anka. So again, a Lebanese Christian expelled from his homeland who landed in Canada would become the author of Frank Sinatra's signature song. This is to say how important, especially in our time, minorities and exiles are how important they are to the host culture, to rejuvenating the host culture. With that, I'd like to begin concluding by suggesting that there may be no peace, or maybe no peace will come to the Near and Middle East before the allogenic ethnos, the dominant ethnos, come to term with their colonialist past. And I'm not talking about Western colonialism here, okay, because colonialism was invented in the East. The institution of colonialism was perfected in the Near East before it traveled to the West. So what I'm talking about here, when I say the colonialists, I'm talking about the last in a series of colonialists that came onto the Middle East, and this refers to the Islamic conquest of the Near East of the 7th century. So unless the dominant ethnos, the descendants of this colonialist enterprise, come to terms with their own colonialist past and do away with the colonialist mentality of the present days and dispose of their colonialist arrogance and their feelings of superiority vis-a-vis the cultures and peoples and languages and histories that they have come to dominate over the centuries, and in many cases sought to replace. And so, unless they recognize that there is a not so good past, and do admit this with humility and honesty and a spirit of respect and humanism and humanity, there may not be peace in the Near East. Some 85 years ago, Armenian-American novelist William Saroyan was already assailing our resigned attitudes of today, the apathy of today, vis-a-vis the disappearance of entire civilizations. 85 years ago, Saroyan was already issuing his own summons and his own indictment against the world's silence before the tragedy of Near Eastern Christians today. In 1933, he wrote a short story, 70,000 Assyrians, and it was his own way, his decent man's refusal to commit the aggrieved Near Eastern Christians to oblivion. It was, of course, the story was not written with today's event in mind, but it may very well be read like a news item from yesterday's newspaper. So 70,000 Assyrians, written in 1933, is 85 years young. It is still relevant for our times. It was written on the heels of the Assyrian genocide, long before the invention of the modern malady of political correctness, at a time when murderers could still be taken to task and when one could still name names and hand down indictments without fear of being badgered with such modern invective as racist and orientalist and Islamophobe and such like. And I'd like to conclude with sort of reading long excerpts from Saroyan's 70,000 Assyrians, because I think it eloquently captures the essence of the plight of Near Eastern Christians today. Now, at times you may notice the text seems to be a bit too frivolous for a depiction of a serious human tragedy, but bear with it. Saroyan's story is a very serious one, and he's a very serious writer, despite the levity that you may detect in the text. His account is that of a subtle, scrupulous, compassionate observer, and his sarcasm is a devastating commentary on political and moral apathy, not unlike Martin Niemöller's famous statement on the crimes of Nazi Germany and the world's apathy then to the Holocaust. Those of you who are familiar with it, first they came for the socialists, but I wasn't a socialist, so I didn't say anything. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't say anything. Then they came for the Jews, and I wasn't Jewish, so I didn't speak out. But then they came for me, and by then there was no one left to speak on my behalf. So that statement came after the fall of Nazi Germany, after we found out what had happened there. So in the mid-1940s, late 1940s, Saroyan's is a precursor to that. It came in 1933. It certainly 70,000 Assyrians is kind of long-winded, and it lacks the lapidary brevity of Niemöller's statement, but the lessons are the same, and the lesson is equally disturbing and moving. Now, in this tale, in 70,000 Assyrians, Saroyan begins by telling us how it had been ages since he'd had a haircut, and how he's beginning to look seedy and unkempt. Saroyan, by the way, you may be able to tell from his last name, is Armenian. So he's an American Armenian novelist. So he says he's beginning, letting his hair grow, began making him look seedy and unkempt, quote, like several violinists out of work and ready to join the Communist Party. In today's terms, you would have said like a hippie. But there were no hippies in 1933. So to the social historians, this text should be very interesting. So began to look unkempt and seedy, like several violinists out of work and ready to join the Communist Party. We barbarians from Asia Minor, people who look like me, that's what he writes, we barbarians from Asia Minor are hairy people. And when we need a haircut, we seriously need a haircut. So he goes to the San Francisco Barbers College for the way he describes it, for a 15-cent haircut. And he lands himself a newly arrived apprentice. And here's what transpires next. Quote, the young man who gave me the haircut was tall. He had a dark, serious face, thick lips on the verge of smiling, but melancholy, thick eyelashes, sad eyes, a large nose. He couldn't have written this today, right? A large nose. I saw his name on the card that was pasted on the mirror in front of me. Theodore Bedal, it said. A good name, genuine. A good young man, genuine. Theodore Bedal began to work on my head. A good barber never speaks before he's spoken to, no matter how full his heart may be. That name, I said, Bedal, are you an Armenian? You see, I'm an Armenian. I've mentioned this before. People look at me and begin to wonder. So I come right out and tell them, I'm an Armenian, I say. Or they may read something I might have written and they begin to wonder, so I let them have it. I'm an Armenian, I say. It's a meaningless remark. But they expect me to say it, so I do. I have no idea what it's like to be an Armenian, or what it's like to be an Englishman, or a Japanese, or anything else. I have a faint idea of what it's like to be alive. This is the only thing that interests me greatly. This and tennis. I hope someday to write a great philosophical work on tennis, something on the order of Death in the Afternoon. But I'm aware that I'm not yet ready to undertake such a project. It may seem to some sophisticated people that I'm trying to make fun of Hemingway. I'm not. Death in the Afternoon is a pretty sound piece of prose. Even when Hemingway is a fool, at least he's an accurate fool. Are you an Armenian? I asked. You see, we're a small people, and whenever one of us meets another, it's an event. We're always looking around for someone to talk in our language. Our most ambitious political party estimates that there are nearly 2 million of us living on Earth, but most of us don't think so. Most of us sit down, take a pencil and a piece of paper, and We take one section of the world at a time and imagine how many Armenians at the most are likely to be living in that section. And we put the highest number on the paper, and then we go on to another section: India, Russia, Soviet Armenia, Egypt, Italy, Germany, France, America, South America, Australia, and so on and so forth. And after we add up our most hopeful figures, the total comes to something a little less than 1 million. Then we start to think how big our families are, how high our birth rate, and how low our death rate. Except in times of war, when massacres increase our death rate. Keep this in mind, okay? The parenthetical statement he makes here. Except how high our birth rate and how low our death rate. Except in times of war, when massacres increase our death rate. And so we begin to imagine how rapidly we will increase if we are left alone even for a quarter century, and we feel pretty good about that. I remember the Near East relief drives in my hometown in California. My uncle used to be our orator, and he used to make a whole auditorium full of Armenians weep. He was an attorney, and he was a great speaker. Well, at first it was the trouble of war. Our people were being destroyed by the enemy. This is reference to World War I and the Armenian genocide. Well, at first, the trouble was war. Our people were being destroyed by the enemy. Those who hadn't been killed were homeless, and they were starving. Our flesh and blood, my uncle said, and we all wept. And we gathered money and sent it out to our people in the old country. Then after the war, when I was a bigger boy, we had another Near East relief drive, and my uncle stood on the stage of the civic auditorium of my hometown, and he said, "Thank God this time it's not the enemy, but an earthquake. God has made us suffer. We have worshipped him through trial and tribulation, through suffering and disease and torture and horror." And my uncle began to weep. He began to sob. "We've worshipped him," he said, "through the madness of despair. And now he has done this to us, and we still worship him, and we still praise him. We don't understand the ways of God." After the drive, I went to my uncle, and I said, "Uncle, did you mean what you said about God?" And he said, "That was oratory, son. We've got to raise money. What God? God is nonsense." "And when you cried," I asked, and my uncle said that was real. I could not help it. I had to cry. Why, for God's sake, why must we go through all this goddamn hell? What have we done to deserve all this torture? Man won't leave us alone. God won't leave us alone. Have we done something wrong? Aren't we supposed to be a pious people? What is our sin? I'm disgusted with God. I'm sick of man. The only reason I'm willing to get up and talk is that I don't dare keep my mouth shut anymore. I can't bear the thought of more of our people dying. Jesus Christ, have we done something wrong? And so I asked Badal, "Are you an Armenian?" He said, "I'm an Assyrian." Well, that is something. They, the Assyrians, came from our part of the world. They had noses like our noses, eyes like our eyes, hearts like our hearts. They had a different language. When they spoke, we couldn't understand them, but they were a lot like us. It wasn't quite as pleasing as it would have been had Badal been an Armenian, but that was really something, an Assyrian. "I'm an Armenian," I said. I used to know some Assyrian boys in my hometown: Joseph Sarkis, Nido, Saleh, Elia, Tony, and he begins mentioning names. "Do you know any of them?" "Joseph Sarkis," said Badal. "I know him. The others I don't. We lived in New York until 5 years ago, and when we came out to West Turlock, we moved later to San Francisco. And so we began to talk about the Assyrian language and the Armenian language, about the old world, conditions over there, and so on. I was getting a 15-cent haircut, I was doing my best to learn something at the same time, to acquire some new truth, some new appreciation of the wonder of life, the dignity of man. Man has great dignity, you know. Do not imagine that he has not. Badal said, I cannot read Assyrian. I was born in the old country, but I want to get over it. He sounded tired, not physically, but spiritually. Why, I said, why do you want to get over it? Well, he laughed, simply because everything is washed up over there. Now, I'm repeating, this is Saroyan, not me, he says, now I'm repeating his words precisely, putting nothing of my own. We were a great people once, he went on, but that was yesterday, the day before yesterday. Now we are a topic in ancient history. We had a great civilization. They're still admiring it. Now I'm in America, learning how to cut hair. We're washed up as a race. We're through. It's all over. Why should I learn to read the language? We have no writers. We have no news. Well, there's a little news. Every once in a while, the English encourage the Arabs to slaughter us, and that's that. It's an old story. We know it all too well. The news comes over to us through the Associated Press. Anyway, these remarks were very painful to me, an Armenian. I'd always felt badly about my own people being destroyed. I'd never heard of an Assyrian speaking in English about such things. I felt great love for this young fellow. Now, don't get me wrong, there is a tendency these days to think in terms of pansies whenever a man says he has affection for another man. I think now I have affection for all people, even for the enemies of Armenia, whom I have so tactfully not named. Everyone knows who they are. I have nothing against any of them because I think of them as one man living one life at a time. And I know, I am positive, that one man at a time is incapable of the monstrosity performed by mobs. My objection is only to mobs. Well, I said, it is much the same with us, you know. We too are old. We still have our churches. We still have a few writers. Aharonian, Ishakian, a few others. But it's much the same. We are the same. Yes, said the barber, I know. We went in for the wrong things. We went in for the simple things, for peace and quiet and families. We didn't go in for the machinery and conquest and militarism. We didn't go in for diplomacy and deceit and the invention of machine guns and poison gases. Oh, well, there's no use in being disappointed, I suppose. We had our day. We are hopeful, I said. There is no Armenian living who doesn't still dream of an independent Armenia. Dream? Said Badal. That is something, man. Assyrians can't even dream anymore. Why? Do you know how many of us are left on earth? 2, 3 million, I suggested. Remember, this is the number, this is the magic number of the Armenians. 2, 3 million, I suggested. 70,000, said Badal. That's all. 70,000 Assyrians in the world. And the Arabs are still killing us. They killed 70 of us in a little uprising last month. There was a small paragraph about it in the paper. 70 more of us destroyed. We'll all be wiped out before long. My brother's married to an American girl, and he has a son. There's no more hope. We're trying to forget Assyria. Excuse me. My father still reads an Assyrian paper that comes from New York, but he's an old man. He will be dead soon. Then his voice changed. He stopped speaking like an Assyrian, and he began to speak like a barber. Have I taken enough off the top? He asked. The rest of the story is pointless. I said so long to the young Assyrian, and I left the shop. I thought about this whole business of Assyria and the Assyrians. I thought of Theodore Badal learning to be a barber, the sadness of his voice, the hopelessness of his attitude. That was months ago, in August. But ever since, I've been thinking about Assyria, and I've been wanting to say something about Theodore Badal. A son of an ancient race, himself youthful and alert, yet hopeless. 70,000 Assyrians, a mere 70,000 of that great people, and all the others quiet in death, and all the greatness crumbled and ignored, and a young man in America learning to be a barber, and a young man lamenting bitterly the course of history. I am thinking of 70,000 Assyrians one at a time, alive, a great race. I am thinking of Theodore Badal, himself 70,000 Assyrians and 70 million Assyrians, himself Assyria and man, standing in a barber shop in San Francisco in 1933, and being still himself the whole Assyrian race. End quote. So folks, that is what is at stake in the Middle East today. Copts, Maronites, Armenians, Assyrians, and others, dwindling Christian minorities, remnants of ancient civilizations, undergoing a silent exodus, an undercover genocide. Precious few remaining specimens of the world's most ancient human civilizations, besieged, abused, brutalized, forgotten, endangered species, barely clinging to their dignity, barely clinging to their lives, barely clinging to their homelands, their ancestral homelands, the very first cradles of our human history. Thank you for sticking around. Until next time, cheers.